At her husband's funeral, his brother unexpectedly proposed marriage to her right at the grave. What happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The sun hung low over the fields, heavy and burning, casting a dense golden haze across the cemetery. A warm wind stirred the long grass around the graves, carrying with it the sharp, damp scent of freshly turned soil. Somewhere nearby, the low murmur of mourning voices tangled with the rustle of trees, but to Amalia, everything sounded distant, muffled, as if she were submerged underwater. She stood still by the open grave, a simple headstone already marking the place where her husband, Caleb, now rested. The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest until it hurt to breathe. Her black dress clung to her skin in the humidity. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a single white lily, Caleb's favorite flower. Around her, a large crowd had gathered, a mix of family, friends, and those who simply felt obligated to attend. Most of them were light-skinned, their features carved from a different world than Amalia's. Though no one said anything aloud, she felt their eyes on her, the subtle, questioning glances, the way their conversations hushed whenever she moved too close. Even after all these years, after building a life with Caleb, after raising children together, she still felt like an outsider standing among them. The priest spoke softly, reading the final prayers, but Amalia barely registered the words. She stared at the grave, trying to will herself to believe it was real, that Caleb was truly gone. Just days ago, he had been laughing at the kitchen table, teasing her about her inability to cook rice without burning it. Just days ago, he had leaned over and kissed her forehead, whispering, "You're my home, Amalia." And now there was nothing but earth and stone and unbearable silence. As the service neared its end, Amalia felt a movement beside her. She turned slightly and saw Richard approaching, Caleb's younger brother. He was tall, immaculately dressed in a tailored navy suit, his skin a few shades lighter than hers, his sharp blue eyes framed by a calculated smile. He had always been charismatic, the kind of man who drew attention without asking for it. In the past, Amalia had tried to be kind to him, even when his jokes had cut too close or his compliments had made her skin crawl. Now, Richard moved toward her with purposeful steps, his face a careful mask of sorrow. Amalia expected him to offer a comforting word, a simple embrace, perhaps. Instead, he did something that shattered the fragile peace she had wrapped herself in. In front of everyone, in front of their children, in front of Caleb's grieving parents, Richard dropped down on one knee. For a second, the world froze. Amalia's heart stopped in her chest. The small crowd collectively gasped. Heads turned. Conversations fell silent. Somewhere in the back, someone let out a startled laugh that quickly died in the air. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, black velvet box. He opened it with a practiced flick of his wrist, revealing a sparkling diamond ring. "Amalia," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice warm and steady, as if he were performing a ceremony. "Caleb loved you dearly. He would have wanted you to be cared for, not left alone to suffer. I promise you, you will never have to face this world by yourself. Marry me." For a long, unbearable moment, Amalia could only stare at him, her mind refusing to process what was happening. Her fingers tightened around the lily stem until it snapped in two. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The humiliation burned through her body like fire, painting her cheeks crimson. She could feel every pair of eyes trained on her, waiting for her response. Some faces were twisted in disbelief, others in pity, some even in cruel amusement. She thought of Caleb lying in the earth just a few feet away, and for the first time since he died, true anger coiled in her chest like a living thing. Without a word, Amalia turned on her heel and walked away, her shoes sinking slightly into the soft ground. The murmurs behind her grew louder, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. If she had, she wasn't sure she would have been able to keep walking. The cemetery blurred around her, the green of the grass, the gray of the tombstones, the splashes of black-clad mourners, all mixing into a dizzying whirl of color and noise. Her breaths came fast and shallow, the weight of humiliation pressing down so hard it threatened to crush her. Reaching the parking lot, she yanked open the door of her battered old car and collapsed inside. For several minutes, she sat frozen, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands, staring at the cracked dashboard. Her entire body shook, not from grief this time, but from rage. She had trusted Richard, or at least tolerated him, for Caleb's sake. She had believed that, at the very least in this raw, sacred moment of loss, he would show basic human decency. Instead, he had turned her husband's funeral into a grotesque public spectacle, a twisted display of ownership, like she was some vulnerable prize to be claimed. A few minutes later, the car door opened and her daughter Leanna slid inside. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with confusion and embarrassment. "Mom," she said softly, I don't know what that was. I'm so sorry." Amalia shook her head, unable to form a coherent response. She didn't blame Leanna. She didn't even fully blame the others who had stood in stunned silence, unsure how to react. The blame lay solely with Richard, the man who had seen her grief as a weakness to exploit. Tears stung the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. Not here. Not now. Without a word, she turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed to life and she pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the cemetery and Richard behind. But she knew, deep down, that this was not over. It was only the beginning. As they drove in silence back toward the estate, Amalia gripped the steering wheel tighter. She could feel it already, the shift in the air, the way her family would look at her differently now. Richard had planted a seed, and whether she wanted it or not, that seed would grow in the minds of everyone who had witnessed his proposal. She would no longer simply be Caleb's widow. She would be the woman who had been offered a lifeline and who had refused it. Back at the house, the guests trickled in slowly, filling the halls with uncomfortable murmurs and clinking glasses. Amalia moved mechanically, accepting condolences, offering tight smiles, nodding where appropriate. She could feel Richard's gaze following her through every room like a shadow she couldn't shake. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the air grew cooler, Amalia found herself standing alone on the back porch, staring out over the sprawling fields Caleb had loved so much. The first star appeared in the sky, faint but steady. Amalia wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the chill sink into her bones. She was alone now, truly alone. And if she wanted to survive what was coming, she would have to find a strength she wasn't sure she still possessed. Behind her, the sliding glass door creaked open. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. "I meant what I said," Richard's voice floated out into the night. "You don't have to do this alone." Amalia closed her eyes, the rage and sorrow warring inside her. "No," she thought, "I won't be alone, but I sure as hell won't be yours." She didn't answer him. Instead, she walked back inside, closing the door firmly behind her. The house, heavy with loss, seemed to sigh around her. And somewhere, deep inside herself, a small spark flared to life. It wasn't much, But it was enough. Enough to fight, enough to survive. And, when the time came, enough to reclaim everything that was rightfully hers. The days that followed Caleb's funeral passed in a haze so thick that Amalia could hardly distinguish one from the next. The world outside the estate seemed to move on without her, but inside the heavy walls of the house, time hung suspended, thick and unbreathable. She moved through it like a sleepwalker, tending to minor tasks, acknowledging guests who stayed longer than they should have, nodding silently to whispered condolences, all while the reality of Caleb's absence loomed over her like a shadow that never shifted. At first, it seemed almost natural that Richard would remain close. After all, he was Caleb's only brother, the one person, some would argue, who shared in her grief most deeply. He lingered in the hallways, took calls from distant relatives, and fielded questions Amalia had neither the energy nor the inclination to answer. He made himself indispensable, stepping into the vacuum left behind by Caleb's death with a quiet certainty that might have seemed noble to the casual observer. Amalia tried to tell herself it was kindness, tried to believe that his constant presence, the way he hovered at her shoulder during estate meetings, the way he gently suggested she get some rest while he handled things, was born of good intentions. But something inside her, something ancient and instinctual, stirred uneasily every time Richard entered a room. It began with small things. One afternoon, Amalia went to the kitchen to retrieve her laptop, only to find it missing from its usual spot on the counter. After a brief search, she found it in Richard's hands in the study. He smiled disarmingly when she entered. "I was just trying to organize a few documents for you," he said smoothly, tapping at the keyboard. "You shouldn't have to deal with all this paperwork right now." The explanation was reasonable enough on the surface, yet Amalia felt a prickle of discomfort climb up the back of her neck as she retrieved the laptop from him. She told herself it was grief, making her overly suspicious, overly sensitive. She tucked the feeling away and said nothing. A few days later, a contractor arrived at the estate unannounced, asking about security system upgrades. When Amalia questioned him, he cheerfully informed her that Mr. Richard had requested the service, citing concerns about Amalia's safety now that she was alone. Amalia hadn't agreed to any such thing. She confronted Richard about it in the hallway that evening. He laughed, a low, easy sound, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Amalia," he said in that slow, patronizing tone he used when speaking to someone he considered fragile, "you have enough to worry about. Let me take care of the details." The words made her skin crawl. It was not the act itself, ordering a security system, but the casual way he assumed authority over her life, the way he made decisions as if her consent were irrelevant. Worse still, she noticed the subtle shift in how others in the family began to treat her. When discussions arose about the estate, legal matters, maintenance of the grounds, financial considerations, people no longer directed their questions to her. They looked to Richard as if he were the natural successor to Caleb's authority. Even her own children, Liana and Marcus, began turning to their uncle for guidance, their trust slipping away from Amalia by degrees so small she could barely catch them until they were already gone. At first, she tried to participate. In one meeting about managing the vineyard Caleb had cultivated over the years, Amalia offered a suggestion about hiring a new foreman. Richard smiled tolerantly, like an adult humoring a child. "Maybe it's best if we leave the technical decisions to the experts," he said, without meeting her eyes. The room agreed silently, nodding, smiling, moving on without her. Amalia sat back, her words dying in her throat, feeling the walls of her own life close around her. It became a pattern. Whenever she spoke, Richard redirected. Whenever she suggested, Richard gently corrected. In public, he was careful never to outright dismiss her, but in every subtle pause, every redirected glance, he trained the family to view her as someone fragile, someone not quite capable of standing on her own. She found herself questioning her own instincts. Was she reading too much into it? Had she truly become too emotional, too unstable to manage everything alone? Then came the night of the dinner. It was a Sunday evening, one of the informal gatherings Caleb had loved. Family, friends, neighbors, easy laughter spilling through the house like sunlight. Amalia decided, almost impulsively, to share something that had brought her a small sense of pride. A painting she had been working on for months, a seascape inspired by the coastline where she and Caleb had once vacationed. She carefully set the canvas on an easel in the living room before the guests arrived, shy but excited, hoping it would be a bridge back to normalcy, a way to reconnect with the life that felt like it was slipping through her fingers. The guests admired it politely. A few offered compliments. Amalia felt a small glow of hope kindle in her chest. Then Richard laughed. "You see?" he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, raising his glass of wine. "That's the beauty of free time. Some of us are busy keeping everything afloat, and others have time to paint waves." Laughter rippled through the room. Not cruel, not intentional, but devastating all the same. Amalia froze, the warmth draining from her body. She caught Liana's hesitant smile, Marcus's averted gaze. Their reactions were small, almost imperceptible, but they cut deeper than any outright insult. She smiled tightly, nodded as if she found the comment amusing, and excused herself to the kitchen. She stood there for a long time, staring at the untouched food on the counter, feeling the humiliation sink into her bones. She was being erased, not by force, not with violence, but with kindness, with laughter, with subtle suggestions that she was incapable, irrelevant, unnecessary. And she was letting it happen. That night, lying awake in the vast bed she and Caleb had shared, Amalia stared at the dark ceiling and felt the enormity of her isolation press down on her. Her children had not meant to abandon her, she knew. They were young, uncertain, clinging to any semblance of stability they could find. And Richard provided that stability. He provided answers, solutions, authority. What did she offer now but sadness and confusion? The thought hollowed her out, but deeper still, beneath the grief, beneath the shame, another emotion stirred, a slow, simmering anger. An anger not just at Richard, but at herself. She had survived worse. She had built a life in the face of prejudice, loneliness, hardship. She had raised two strong, beautiful children. She had stood by Caleb's side through every storm. And now she was letting herself be reduced to a ghost. No more. The thought whispered through her like a promise. No more. The next morning, she rose early before the household stirred. She packed a small bag, just enough clothes for a few days, her journal, Caleb's old sweater, and walked out the front door without telling anyone. She didn't leave a note. She didn't answer the texts or calls that began to light up her phone as the day wore on. She simply drove, heading south, following the coastline, searching for a place where the voices of others could no longer reach her. The road unspooled before her like a lifeline, and for the first time in weeks, Amalia felt a flicker of something that had nothing to do with grief. Freedom. She didn't know where she was going, not really. But she knew what she was leaving behind. A house that no longer felt like hers, a family she no longer recognized, and a life that had been slowly, carefully stolen from her while she stood still. And somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon, beyond the pain, beyond the silence, was the woman she had once been, the woman she would find again, the woman who had never needed saving. Not from Richard, not from grief, not from anyone. Only from forgetting herself. And she would remember, even if it killed her. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt unspooling through the fields and forest, leading Amalia away from everything she had known. She kept her hands steady on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the horizon, even as the ache in her chest pulsed in time with every mile she put between herself and the estate. The early morning sun broke across the windshield, flooding the car with a harsh, golden light that seemed almost accusatory, illuminating the lines on her face, the weariness in her posture, the hollowed spaces where hope had once lived. She drove without music, without a clear destination, letting instinct guide her. Memories flickered past the windows like ghosts. Caleb's laughter as he repaired the porch swing, Liana's first steps across the wide oak floors, Marcus running barefoot through the fields in late summer. Each image stabbed at her heart, but she refused to turn back, refused to let sentimentality anchor her to a life that no longer welcomed her. By late afternoon, the landscape began to shift. The trees thinned, giving way to open fields and glimpses of the distant coastline. The salty tang of the sea drifted in through the cracked window, stirring memories of long-forgotten summers, of promises whispered in the dark. She remembered the small coastal town she and Caleb had once stumbled upon during a road trip in their 20s, a forgotten place with crumbling docks and weather-beaten cottages where they had sworn they would return someday when the world became too much. It was there that she turned now, without fully realizing she had made the decision. The town was smaller than she remembered, a handful of shops clustered along the main street, a scattering of houses perched like stubborn sentinels against the encroaching sea. The years had not been kind to it. Paint peeled from weathered facades, the sidewalks cracked and uneven, but there was a quiet dignity in its decay that resonated with something deep inside her. She found a modest inn tucked behind a faded cafe, its sign swinging crookedly in the breeze. The woman at the front desk, an elderly lady with kind eyes and a gravelly voice, barely looked up as Amalia signed the register under a false name. No questions were asked, no judgments made. It was exactly what she needed. The room was small, with thin walls and a window that rattled in its frame whenever the wind picked up. The bed sagged slightly in the middle, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and old tobacco. Yet, as Amalia closed the door behind her, she felt an unexpected sense of safety settle over her shoulders like a worn but familiar cloak. She set her bag down carefully on the chair, pulled the heavy curtains shut, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the threadbare carpet. For a long time, she simply sat there, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. It was not the suffocating silence of the estate, where every quiet moment was laden with expectations and judgments. This was different. This was the silence of true solitude, of anonymity. Here, she could fall apart without witnesses. When the tears came, they came without warning, breaking free in great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She wept for Caleb, for the life they had built and lost. She wept for her children, for the fragile bond that now felt so strained and brittle. She wept for herself, for the woman she had become, diminished, uncertain, invisible. The sun dipped below the horizon as she cried, and still she did not move. Only when the room was cloaked in darkness did she finally lie back on the bed, curling into herself like a wounded animal, and let exhaustion drag her down into a merciful, dreamless sleep. The following days blurred together in a haze of grief and numbness. Amalia wandered the deserted streets of the town during the early mornings, when the mist still clung to the ground and the world seemed suspended between waking and dreaming. She avoided the eyes of the few locals she passed, pulling her jacket tighter around her body as if to shield herself from their curiosity. At night, she sat by the window of her room, staring out at the restless sea. The waves crashed against the rocks in a constant, tireless rhythm, a sound that was both soothing and maddening in its persistence. It reminded her that the world would keep turning, no matter how broken she felt. On the third evening, after a particularly long and aimless walk along the shoreline, Amalia returned to her room to find that the contents of her bag had shifted during her absence. Her hand brushed against something firm and familiar at the bottom, a small, battered wooden box Caleb had given her years ago, a place to store memories, he had said. She pulled it out with trembling fingers and set it on the bed. The latch stuck briefly before giving way, and inside she found a collection of items that seemed almost too fragile to touch. Old photographs, a few postcards, Caleb's favorite fountain pen. Beneath it all, folded carefully and sealed in a worn envelope, was a letter addressed to her in Caleb's handwriting. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at it. For a moment, she couldn't bring herself to open it. The sight of his familiar, looping script was almost more than she could bear. It was a bridge between the life she had lost and the life she now inhabited, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to cross it. But slowly, carefully, she broke the seal. The letter was dated just weeks before Caleb's death. His words spilled across the page in ink that had smudged slightly, as if his hand had trembled while writing. My dearest Amalia, if you are reading this, then something has happened that neither of us could have prepared for. I don't want to burden you with fears that may never come to pass, but there are things you need to know, things I should have said out loud but couldn't bring myself to. I fear for you, my love. Not because you are weak, you are the strongest person I have ever known, but because others may try to take advantage of your kindness, your grief, your trust. Richard, he is not the man he pretends to be. I have seen glimpses of his true nature, and it chills me to the bone. I have taken steps to protect you, to protect what we built together. Trust no one blindly, Amalia, especially not him. I have transferred all our assets into a trust, one that only you and the children have access to. Richard has no legal claim, no authority. If he tries to say otherwise, he is lying. You are not alone, even when it feels like you are. You carry my love with you always. Find the strength I know lives inside you. Fight for yourself, for our family, for the life we dreamed of. I love you more than words could ever capture. Yours forever, Caleb. Amalia pressed the letter to her chest, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her cheeks. But this time, the tears were different. They were not the hopeless, helpless tears of mourning. They were the fierce, burning tears of awakening. Caleb had believed in her. Caleb had seen the danger when she had been too blinded by loyalty to see it for herself. He had trusted her to be strong, even when he could no longer stand by her side. And she would honor that trust. She folded the letter carefully, placing it back into the box, and wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. She sat for a long time, thinking, feeling the shape of determination begin to form inside her chest like the slow gathering of a storm. Richard had underestimated her. Everyone had. They saw only the widow, the grieving woman, the lost soul clinging to the remnants of a broken life. But they would see soon enough. They would see what it looked like when a woman rebuilt herself from ashes. The next morning, she packed her few belongings and checked out of the inn. The woman at the front desk didn't ask questions. She simply handed Amalia the receipt and wished her luck in a voice that sounded genuine. Amalia stepped out into the pale morning light, the salty breeze tugging at her hair, and breathed deeply for the first time in what felt like years. She had no clear map, no detailed plan, but she had something far more powerful. She had purpose. And for the first time since Caleb's death, Amalia smiled. Not a brittle, polite smile, but a small, fierce curve of the lips born of certainty. There would be no more running, no more hiding, no more letting others define her worth. It was time to go back, time to reclaim what was hers, time to become the woman Caleb had always known she could be, time to remember who she was. The journey back toward the town unfolded slowly, each mile a quiet reclamation of self. Amalia kept the letter close, tucked safely in the inner pocket of her jacket where she could feel its reassuring presence against her heart. The words Caleb had left for her had awakened something that had been dormant too long, something fierce and steady. She was no longer the woman who had fled in tears from her own home. She was a woman with a mission, a woman with a plan entrusted to her by the man who had known her truest self even when she had forgotten. The small coastal town faded into the distance behind her as she merged onto the highway, her hands firm on the wheel. She did not rush. Every decision now would be deliberate, every step carefully chosen. She could not afford mistakes, not when Richard had already proven how easily he could turn trust into a weapon. By late afternoon, she pulled into the outskirts of a larger town, one bustling enough to offer anonymity but small enough to avoid unnecessary attention. She found a modest motel tucked between a gas station and a diner, paid for a week's stay in cash, and settled into a room that smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old smoke. It wasn't much, but it was safe, and for now, that was enough. The first thing she did was retrieve Caleb's letter and reread it, committing every detail to memory. He had mentioned a trust, one secured specifically in her name and the names of their children, protected from outside influence. He had named a lawyer, someone Amalia remembered meeting once, briefly, at a family barbecue years ago. Caleb had spoken highly of him, calling him thorough and loyal, the kind of man who understood the importance of discretion. The letter had also included a list of documents Caleb had carefully prepared: transfers of assets, modifications to the estate, provisions for the children's futures. Caleb had thought of everything, and Amalia felt a fresh wave of gratitude for the man who, even facing his own mortality, had placed her security above his own fears. The next morning, after a restless night spent turning plans over in her mind, she found a public library and used a computer there to look up the law firm Caleb had named. To her immense relief, it still existed, tucked into an unassuming brick building on the quieter side of town. She called the number listed, her hand shaking slightly as she held the receiver to her ear. "Weston and Price Law Offices," came a crisp voice after 2 rings. "How may I help you?" Amalia cleared her throat, steadying her voice. "I'd like to schedule an appointment with Mr. Weston. It's regarding a trust established by my late husband, Caleb Harper." There was a pause, a rustle of papers. Then the receptionist's tone softened. "Of course, Mrs. Harper. Mr. Weston has been expecting that call. When would you like to come in?" "Expecting me." The words settled over her like a balm, a confirmation that Caleb's preparations had been real, that she wasn't simply chasing hope. They scheduled the appointment for the following morning. Amalia spent the rest of the day preparing, organizing the few documents she had brought with her, drafting a list of questions. She knew she couldn't afford to appear confused or overwhelmed. She had to present herself as the rightful guardian of Caleb's legacy, not the fragile widow Richard had painted her to be. That night, she sat by the window of her motel room, watching the neon lights from the gas station flicker against the dark sky. She thought of her children, of Liana's uncertain smile and Marcus's quick, worried glances. She missed them fiercely, but she knew she couldn't reach out to them yet. Not until she had solid ground beneath her feet. Not until she could offer them truth instead of more uncertainty. The next morning dawned gray and cool, a mist hanging over the streets. Amalia dressed carefully, choosing a dark blue blouse and black slacks. Professional, but unassuming. She braided her hair back tightly, brushed a hint of color onto her cheeks to disguise the weariness beneath her eyes, and set out for the law office with Caleb's letter clutched tightly in her purse. The building was modest, its windows lined with green shutters, a brass plaque by the door announcing the firm's name. Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather and old books. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes and a sympathetic smile, ushered Amalia into a waiting room furnished with deep armchairs and heavy oak tables. After a few minutes, a man emerged from a side office. He was older than she remembered, with silver hair and a slight stoop to his shoulders, but his eyes were sharp behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Harper," he said, extending his hand. "Clay Weston. It's good to finally meet you under different circumstances." Amalia rose and shook his hand, the steadiness of his grip reassuring. They settled into his office, a cozy room lined with shelves of thick legal volumes. Weston listened patiently as she explained who she was and why she had come. When she finished, he nodded slowly and pulled a thick folder from a locked cabinet behind his desk. "Your husband was very thorough," he said, flipping open the folder. He anticipated the possibility of interference. He instructed us to prepare for this eventuality. He laid out document after document before her, copies of the trust, amendments to the will, detailed instructions regarding the management of the estate. Caleb's careful, deliberate handwriting appeared on many of the pages, initialed and notarized. All assets were transferred into a trust under your name and the names of your children, Weston explained. Richard Harper has no legal claim to any of it. He is explicitly excluded from decision-making authority. Amalia exhaled slowly, a tremor of relief passing through her. The safety net Caleb had woven was real. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't at Richard's mercy. "There's more," Weston said, his voice lowering slightly. "Your husband also left a sealed letter for you. Instructions, if certain conditions were met." He passed her a second envelope, heavier than the first. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it. "I'll leave you alone to read it," Weston said gently, standing and stepping out of the room. Amalia broke the seal carefully. The letter inside was longer, more detailed, written in Caleb's firm, familiar hand. He warned her again about Richard, about the likelihood that he would attempt to manipulate her in her grief. He advised her to move quickly, to reclaim control over their assets before Richard could gain a foothold through social pressure or deceit. He outlined steps she should take: contacting specific financial advisors, resetting passwords, notifying key parties of her authority. Above all, he urged her not to doubt herself. "You are stronger than you know, Amalia," he had written. "You have always been the heart of this family. Don't let anyone make you forget that. When Weston returned, Amalia was ready. Her voice was steady as she outlined the actions she wanted to take. Immediate reassertion of her control over the trust, official notifications to all institutions involved, revocation of any unofficial access that might have been granted in the chaos following Caleb's death. Weston nodded approvingly, taking notes. "We can begin today," he said. "It will take time, but we'll move carefully, quietly." That was exactly what Amalia wanted. No drama, no open confrontation, not yet. She would rebuild her position piece by piece, silently and thoroughly, until there was nothing Richard could cling to when she finally faced him. She spent the rest of the afternoon with Weston's staff, filling out forms, signing documents, authorizing actions. It was exhausting work mentally and emotionally, but with every signature, every notarized seal, she felt herself reclaiming a piece of the life she had thought lost. By the time she returned to the motel that evening, the sky had cleared, the stars sharp against the dark velvet of night. She sat at the small table by the window, the folder of documents spread out before her, and allowed herself a small, hard smile. This was only the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, still betrayals to confront, wounds to heal, truths to reveal. But she was no longer running. She was no longer hiding. Amalia Harper was preparing for war, and this time she would not lose. Amalia left the law office that day with a different weight pressing against her chest. It was not the leaden, stifling sorrow that had haunted her for weeks, but a dense, humming force. Resolve, gathering slowly but surely, like a distant storm preparing to break. She carried the folder of finalized documents pressed against her side, a physical shield that felt heavier and more reassuring than any embrace. The next few days were spent in careful, deliberate silence. She moved between banks and legal offices with methodical precision, resetting accounts, securing ownership, rerouting communications. With the help of Mr. Weston and his discreet network, Amalia severed every unauthorized access point Richard had tried to create. Notifications went out quietly to the estate's accountants, business partners, maintenance staff. Everyone who had once accepted instructions from Richard would now report solely to her. There were moments when fear gnawed at her resolve, when the enormity of what she was undertaking threatened to overwhelm her. She was, after all, just one woman standing against a tide of manipulation that had nearly swept her away. But each step forward added a new layer to her armor. Each document signed, each password reset, each phone call redirected was a brick laid in the foundation of her reclaimed life. She knew better than to announce her presence. Not yet. Richard thrived on perception, on the image he had so carefully crafted of himself as the protector, the necessary guide for a grieving, incapable widow. If she revealed herself too soon, he would spin a new story, paint her caution as instability, her strength as recklessness. No, she would not give him that opportunity. She would move in the shadows, unseen, until every avenue he might use against her had been quietly and irrevocably closed. Amalia found a modest, furnished apartment on the edge of the neighboring town, a small, nondescript place where no one asked questions. She signed the lease under her maiden name, paid the rent several months in advance, and set up a private post office box to reroute all her correspondence. She kept her phone turned off most of the time, checking messages only sparingly, careful not to leave any digital trail that might lead Richard or even her own children to her too soon. The apartment became her war room. The dining table was covered with papers, copies of legal documents, lists of accounts, contact information for loyal allies Caleb had left behind. She created a meticulous timeline, documenting everything from the day of Caleb's death to Richard's first overstep, noting every suspicious action, every moment of public humiliation he had orchestrated. At night, she wrote in a journal she had purchased from a small bookstore down the street. Long, unfiltered entries poured out of her, recounting the pain, the betrayal, the moments when she had nearly given up. She wrote letters to Caleb, too, spilling her heart onto the pages, telling him about her fears, her small victories, her determination to honor the faith he had placed in her. And slowly, in that quiet, hidden space, she began to rebuild not just her defenses, but herself. The days blurred into weeks. Her hair grew longer, her face gained back some of the color and strength it had lost. She bought a few new clothes, simple but well made, pieces that made her feel grounded and purposeful. She went for long walks in the early mornings when the streets were empty and the world seemed suspended between night and day, letting the cool air clear her mind. Through Weston's contacts, she received updates about the estate. Richard, it seemed, had begun to notice the changes. His access to financial accounts had been blocked. His calls to lawyers and business partners went unanswered. Inquiries he made were deflected or denied. He grew frustrated, according to one discreet report, snapping at staff, making thinly veiled accusations of sabotage. Amalia allowed herself no satisfaction at these reports. Satisfaction was premature. There was still too much work to be done, and Richard was not the kind of man to give up easily. If anything, she knew he would double down, seek other ways to regain control. She had to stay ahead of him, anticipate his moves before he made them. One evening, as she sat at the dining table reviewing her notes, her phone vibrated softly against the wood. A message from Liana blinked on the screen, a simple line of text that struck Amalia straight through the heart. "Mom, where are you? We're worried." Amalia stared at the words for a long time, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She ached to respond, to reassure her daughter, to bridge the widening chasm between them. But she couldn't. Not yet. She needed to be stronger still, needed to be untouchable before she reached out. Anything less would only give Richard more ammunition. She set the phone down carefully, her heart heavy but her resolve intact. In the weeks that followed, she continued to tighten her control over the estate. She changed the locks on the main house remotely, using the security company Caleb had trusted. She rerouted deliveries, canceled unnecessary services, reassigned contracts to vendors she personally approved. Every change was small, almost imperceptible to those living there, but together they formed a noose tightening slowly around Richard's ambitions. She knew the moment would come when she could no longer remain in the shadows. Sooner or later, Richard would attempt something too blatant, too aggressive, and she would have to step into the light to confront him. But she would do so on her terms, not his. Late one evening, as she sat by the window watching a storm roll in over the horizon, she thought of the woman she had been when she first fled the estate. Broken, humiliated, afraid. That woman was gone now. In her place stood someone tempered by grief, sharpened by betrayal, fortified by love and loyalty and sheer will. She was no longer a widow adrift in her own life. She was a warrior. And the battle was just beginning. The following morning, she arranged a meeting with a private investigator, a woman recommended by Weston, someone known for her discretion and effectiveness. Amalia met her at a small cafe on the edge of town, a place where they could talk without drawing attention. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Ellen, listened carefully as Amalia outlined her situation. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty reassurances. When Amalia finished, Ellen nodded once. "We can build the file you'll need," she said simply. "Paper trail, witness statements, documentation of everything he's tried to do." Amalia's shoulders sagged with relief. She had allies now. She wasn't fighting alone. Over the next 2 weeks, Ellen's team dug deep, uncovering a web of deceit more tangled than Amalia had feared. Richard had not only attempted to gain control of the estate, he had spread rumors among family and friends suggesting that Amalia was unstable, incapable of managing her own affairs. He had positioned himself as the savior, the only rational guardian in a sea of emotional chaos. It was a careful, calculated character assassination, and, for a while, it had worked. But not anymore. Amalia compiled every report, every piece of evidence, into a thick binder she kept by her side. She didn't intend to take Richard to court, at least not yet, but she needed the truth. She needed to be ready for whatever story he tried to spin when the confrontation finally came. And it would come. She felt it gathering on the horizon, the inevitable collision between the lie Richard had built and the truth she carried in her hands. Until then, she waited, prepared, unseen, unbreakable. The nights were hardest. Sometimes she would wake in the early hours, her heart pounding, memories of Richard's smug smile and Caleb's steady hands flashing across her mind like jagged lightning. She would sit by the window, wrapped in Caleb's old sweater, and whisper promises into the dark. "I'm coming home," she would say, "on my terms, and I will not be moved." The days grew shorter, the air crisper. Autumn crept into the landscape, painting the trees in shades of fire and gold. Tea was the season Caleb had loved most, the season of endings and beginnings. It was almost time. Amalia stood before the mirror one morning, studying her reflection. The woman who stared back at her was not the same woman who had crumbled at a graveside, who had fled into the night with nothing but grief and shattered pride. This woman was forged from grief but no longer defined by it. Her spine was straight, her gaze was steady, and her heart, though scarred, beat with the steady, unyielding rhythm of purpose. Soon she would return not as a supplicant, not as a broken widow pleading for her place, but as the rightful master of her own life, her own legacy. Richard would not see her coming, but he would feel the impact of her return. Of that she had no doubt. As she gathered the binder, the letters, the documents, preparing for the next phase, a small smile curved her lips. The shadows had been her refuge, but now they would be her weapon. The air was crisp and sharp the morning Amalia decided it was time. She stood by the window of her small apartment, watching the thin mist dissolve into a pale autumn sun. The binder lay open on the table behind her, a silent testament to weeks of patient, deliberate work. Every page was a blade honed to precision, every document a silent witness to the betrayal that had festered unchecked. She had spent enough time in the shadows. The time for silence was over. Amalia packed carefully, folding her clothes with meticulous care, placing the binder and all the crucial documents into a reinforced leather satchel. Her hands moved steadily, without hesitation. This was not a mission fueled by anger, though anger simmered quietly beneath her skin. It was duty. It was justice. The drive back to the estate was long, but felt shorter than she expected. The familiar roads unspooled before her, carrying her toward a confrontation that had been inevitable since the moment Richard had dropped to one knee by Caleb's grave. She kept the windows slightly open, letting the cold air sharpen her senses, keeping her alert. She did not listen to music. She needed the silence to anchor herself, to remember every promise she had whispered in the lonely hours before dawn. As the gates of the estate came into view, Amalia slowed, her hands tightening on the wheel. The property looked much the same. The manicured lawns, the sprawling oak trees, the neat gravel paths winding through the gardens Caleb had tended with such pride. But she knew better than to be deceived by appearances. Underneath the familiar facade, rot had crept into the foundation. She entered the code into the gate's keypad. A new code, one she had programmed herself through the security company without Richard's knowledge, and the heavy iron gates swung open without hesitation. She drove slowly up the long driveway, her heart beating a steady, measured rhythm. When she pulled up to the main house, she saw Richard immediately. He was standing on the front porch, a cell phone pressed to his ear, his posture tense and irritated. He wore a crisp shirt and slacks, the uniform of a man who still believed himself in control. When he caught sight of her, his entire body went rigid. Amalia stepped out of the car with deliberate calm, slinging the satchel over her shoulder. She closed the door behind her, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cold morning air. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Richard ended his call abruptly and descended the porch steps, plastering a smile onto his face that didn't reach his eyes. "Amalia," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of welcome that reeked of falsehood. "We've been so worried. Where have you been?" Amalia let the question hang in the air, heavy and unanswered. She walked past him without a word, her heels crunching against the gravel, and mounted the porch steps. She could feel his eyes on her back, could sense the calculations already spinning behind his gaze. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke and expensive cologne. It was clean, orderly, but stripped of the warmth that had once defined it. Caleb's presence had been carefully erased. No photographs on the side tables, no scattered gardening gloves by the door, no familiar clutter that had once made the house a home. In its place was something sterile and hollow. Amalia moved to the living room and placed the satchel carefully on the coffee table. She turned to face Richard, who had followed her inside, his expression now guarded. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and even. He laughed, a brittle sound. "Of course. There's so much to discuss. You've been gone for weeks. The estate," Amalia interrupted, "is none of your concern." Richard's mouth snapped shut. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, quickly masked by a smirk. "I understand," he said, adopting a conciliatory tone. "You're upset. It's been a difficult time for all of us. Let's sit down, go over everything together. We can figure this out." Amalia opened the satchel and pulled out the binder. She placed it on the table between them, her movements slow and deliberate. "I'm not here to figure anything out," she said. "I'm here to end this." Richard's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, trying to loom over her, to reassert the dominance he had wielded so easily before. But Amalia didn't flinch. She opened the binder and began laying out the documents one by one. Copies of the trust, amendments to the will, records of financial transactions, notarized statements from lawyers and accountants. Richard's face paled as he scanned the pages. His bravado faltered. This doesn't change anything," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You've been unstable, Amalia. Everyone knows it. The family, Amalia said, her voice slicing cleanly through his protest, will see the truth." She pulled out the final piece, a copy of Caleb's sealed letter, along with corroborating affidavits from the legal witnesses who had overseen its drafting. Caleb's own words, warning her of Richard's intentions, laying bare his manipulations, his greed. Richard stared at the papers, his face mottling with anger and fear. "You can't prove—" "I don't need to prove anything," Amalia said. "The documents speak for themselves. The accounts have been secured. The house is in my name. The businesses are under new management. You have no access, no authority, no power." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked smaller somehow, less imposing. Stripped of his illusions, he was nothing more than a desperate man who had gambled on another's grief and lost. Amalia gathered the documents back into the binder with slow precision. She straightened, fixing Richard with a gaze that was calm, unyielding. "You will leave this house today," she said. "You will not return. If you attempt to contact me, or my children, or interfere with the estate in any way, legal action will follow immediately." For a moment, he just stood there, breathing hard, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. The mask he wore cracked, revealing the bitter, entitled man beneath. "You think you're better than me?" he hissed. "You think you can just erase me?" Amalia stepped closer, her voice soft but laced with iron. "You erased yourself, Richard, when you chose to betray the people who loved you." She turned away from him, signaling the end of the conversation. She moved to the front door and opened it wide, the morning sun flooding into the house. Richard stood frozen for a moment longer, the battle raging behind his eyes. Then, with a snarl of frustration, he grabbed his coat from the hall tree and stalked past her out into the yard. Amalia watched as he climbed into his car, slamming the door so hard the vehicle rocked on its wheels. He peeled down the driveway, a trail of dust rising in his wake. When the sound of his engine faded into silence, Amalia closed the door gently. She leaned against it for a long moment, her eyes closed, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming release of pressure. It was done. Richard was gone. The house was hers again. Her knees nearly gave out from the flood of emotions crashing through her, but she forced herself upright, moving through the house slowly, touching familiar surfaces, reclaiming each room with silent gratitude. In the kitchen, she ran her hand over the worn wooden counter where Caleb had loved to knead bread dough on lazy Sunday mornings. In the living room, she sank briefly onto the old leather sofa, breathing in the faint, lingering scent of home. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the branches of the oaks, scattering leaves across the lawn in a dance of crimson and gold. The estate felt different now, not haunted, not hollow. It felt at peace. Amalia moved through the house until she reached the back porch, stepping out into the crisp air. The garden Caleb had planted sprawled before her, a riot of late blooms and untamed vines. She smiled through the sting of tears. She had not fought for the house itself, or the money, or even the name. She had fought for the life she and Caleb had built together, the sanctuary they had created with their own hands and love. She had fought for herself, and she had won. Amalia Harper stood alone beneath the wide, endless sky, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she was not afraid. Not of Richard, not of grief, not of herself. She was home, and she would never be erased again. The days that followed Richard's departure unfolded with a surreal quiet that Amalia found both unfamiliar and deeply necessary. The house, once saturated with the heavy, suffocating tension of unspoken battles and silent resentments, now exhaled with her. Each step she took down the wide hallways felt lighter, each breath a little less labored. The rooms that had once felt like cages had become places of rest again, patient spaces waiting for her to fill them with new meaning. Amalia spent the first morning after Richard's departure walking through every room of the house, touching familiar objects, reclaiming the spaces that had once defined her life. She opened windows that had long been sealed shut, letting the cool autumn air sweep through the house, carrying away the stale remnants of fear and doubt. She pulled white sheets off old furniture in rooms she hadn't entered in months, watched as motes of dust spun through shafts of sunlight, as if the house itself were waking up from a long, uneasy sleep. In the living room, she found a box tucked behind the sofa, filled with photographs she thought had been lost. Images of Caleb smiling beneath the summer sun, of Liana and Marcus as children building forts in the backyard, of Amalia herself, younger and stronger than she remembered feeling. She sat cross-legged on the floor for hours, sifting through those memories, letting them stitch themselves back into the fabric of her life. The garden Caleb had planted behind the house was wild now. Unruly vines overtaking the neat beds he had once tended with careful hands. Amalia spent afternoons out there, pulling weeds, cutting back the overgrowth, her hands in the dirt, feeling the earth anchor her to something solid and enduring. She wore Caleb's old gardening gloves, patched and worn at the fingers, and sometimes she caught herself speaking to him aloud, telling him about her day, about the quiet victories she claimed one by one. The work was slow, methodical, but it healed something inside her that she hadn't realized was still bleeding. The children came next. It started with a cautious text from Marcus asking if she needed anything from the store, followed by a tentative call from Liana that same evening. They didn't mention Richard. They didn't ask questions about where she had gone or what she had done. Instead, they talked about small things, the weather, the vineyard, the upcoming holidays, as if testing the waters, unsure if they were still welcome. Amalia answered their calls when they came. She listened more than she spoke, letting them find their own way back to her without pressure or expectation. It was not the same easy intimacy they had once shared, but it was real, and it was enough for now. One Saturday afternoon, Amalia found herself standing in the kitchen, rolling dough for biscuits the way Caleb had once taught her, when she heard a knock at the front door. She wiped her hands on a towel and opened it to find Liana and Marcus standing on the porch, each holding a potted plant like an offering. "We thought the garden could use some new life," Liana said, her voice soft. Amalia stepped aside without a word, pulling them both into a tight embrace that said everything she could not. They spent the day together in the backyard, planting the new flowers, laughing awkwardly at first, and then more easily as the afternoon wore on. It wasn't a perfect reunion. There were still silences, still wounds healing beneath the surface, but it was a beginning. A new foundation built not on old expectations or unspoken resentments, but on honesty and the hard-earned knowledge of what it meant to lose and find each other again. That evening, after they had gone, Amalia sat alone on the back porch, a mug of tea warming her hands, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The air smelled of fresh-turned earth and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the low hum of crickets. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment: the grief, the betrayal, the long, painful climb back to herself, and felt a deep, abiding peace settle into her bones. It was not the naive peace of someone who believed the world could no longer hurt her, but the hard-won peace of someone who knew she could survive whatever came next. Over the next weeks, Amalia began to rebuild not just her home, but her life. She reopened the vineyard Caleb had so lovingly nurtured, hiring a small, dedicated staff who shared her vision of creating a place rooted in family and community rather than profit and prestige. She transformed the old barn into a tasting room, hanging fairy lights along the rafters, placing photographs of Caleb and their family along the walls. The vineyard became a gathering place once again, not for the formal, stiff events Richard had once envisioned, but for the laughter of friends and neighbors, the warm, chaotic joy of families picnicking under the sprawling oaks, the simple pleasure of good wine shared among good people. Amalia also started a small foundation in Caleb's name, dedicated to supporting women who, like her, had found themselves battling not just grief, but the silent erasure that so often followed. She partnered with local organizations, offering scholarships, legal aid, and counseling services. It was work that filled her days with purpose, that gave meaning to the suffering she had endured. And through it all, she wrote. In the quiet hours before dawn, she filled journal after journal with her story, not just the story of her loss and survival, but the story of her love for Caleb, of the life they had built, and the lessons they had learned together. She wrote for herself, but also for Liana and Marcus, and for anyone who might one day need to be reminded that survival was not just about enduring, but about reclaiming, about rising. The seasons shifted around her. The vibrant fire of autumn gave way to the stark, skeletal beauty of winter, and then slowly to the tentative bloom of spring. Life, indifferent and relentless, moved forward, carrying her with it. One evening, nearly a year after Richard's departure, Amalia stood once more on the back porch, the vineyard stretching out before her in neat, budding rows. The rosemary bush Caleb had planted near the steps had survived the winter, its scent sharp and clean in the cool evening air. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting the wind whip around her, lifting the edges of her sweater, tangling her hair. She thought of Caleb, not with the sharp ache of loss, but with a deep, enduring gratitude. He had trusted her to find her way. He had given her the tools, the faith, the freedom, and she had done it. She had found her way back to herself. Amalia opened her eyes and smiled, a slow, genuine smile that warmed her from the inside out. This was not the life she had planned. It was better. It was hers. She turned and walked back into the house, the screen door slamming lightly behind her, the sound echoing in the evening air like a final, resounding promise. She was not broken. She was not lost. She was not waiting for life to happen to her. She was living it, fully, fiercely, unapologetically. And whatever came next, she would meet it head-on, not as a shadow of who she had once been, but as the woman she had fought so hard to become. The woman who had chosen herself. The woman who had come home. The woman who was at last free. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for more powerful narratives. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear it.